Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Morphy's taking a look at a really cool version of the Thompson submachine gun. This is the US military M1 pattern. It's the original simplified Thompson before the M1A1, which was the final version, and most of the M1s that were produced were eventually updated to M1A1 configuration. So it's pretty rare to find one in this configuration still. So, as a backdrop, when World War II begins, the US military has some Thompson guns in inventory. They're kind of the one option available. Ricings are not, we'll cover the Ricings, have covered the Ricings in a different story, but Thompsons are what is available. And specifically what's available, what the US military has, is the M1928A1 pattern, this guy. And this is a well-liked gun, it's a reliable gun, it's a durable gun, it's a good gun, it's a heavy gun, but that's not going to change here. But it's also a really expensive gun to manufacture and to purchase. The British are buying a bunch of these too. They don't like the price either, but they're buying anything they can get their hands on. And there's a lot of extraneous features on this gun. The action is more complex than it needs to be. You've got this fancy vertical bankster grip on here that, like, really, do we need that in a military setting? The Cutt's compensator is of kind of questionable utility. The rear sight's really complicated and expensive on this thing. Talks begin in late 1941 about how do we increase production of the Thompson gun, because we need more. Britain's already buying up everything they can get their hands on, and the US wants some too. And the solution is, well, we need to simplify the gun. That'll make it cheaper, which is nice, but it also makes it more efficient to manufacture, which means we can make more of them with the existing production facilities, and that's the real goal here. So, at this time, Auto Ordnance is contracting with the US military because they own the rights to the gun. They're subcontracting manufacture to the Savage Arms Company. Savage's engineers at the end of 1941 and into the beginning of 1942, go to work coming up with a simplified version of the Thompson. Like, how do we retain magazine use and as many parts as possible, but dramatically simplify the manufacture? By February of 1942, they've come up with a prototype of this, the M1 version of the Thompson. So they initially do their own testing. They put 10,000 rounds through a prototype and it runs fine. They send it to Auto Ordnance. Auto Ordnance then forwards it to the military. Interestingly, the Savage Company doesn't make any request for patents or royalties or basically any sort of financial compensation for the engineering work that they put into simplifying the gun and developing what is essentially a new version of the Thompson. And I suspect it's because they recognize that at the high cost of the 28A1, its days were limited, and if they wanted to continue being in the business of manufacturing and selling Thompson guns, they had to come up with something simpler and cheaper, or people were going to find some other option that wasn't a Thompson. So it was really in their own interest to come up with a cheaper version of the thing. At any rate, they do. Aberdeen Proving Grounds runs some tests on the gun. They're really fairly abbreviated tests. This is seen as sort of an improvement to an existing design. The existing design is well known, well understood, well liked. The improvements don't really do a lot to potentially cause problems, so testing is fairly short. By March 21st, 1942, Aberdeen's done. They recommend it for approval, for adoption, and it is adopted in April of 1942 as the M1 Thompson. This, of course, in 1928, they were still in the period of US military designations were date-based. By the time we get to 1942, now things are they're sequentially designated. This becomes the first submachine gun in the new series of designations, so it becomes the M1, which would go on to equip troops alongside M1 carbines, M1 rifles, M1 helmets, M1 mortars, M1 tanks, you name it. Anyway, let's take a closer look at exactly what they did, because the changes here are really quite substantial and significant. We'll start with the markings here. We have Thompson submachine gun, caliber 45, M1, notably there, serial number, of course. We have the Thompson bullet logo here on the top of the receiver. If you can't read it, that's actually Thompson's signature inside the bullet. And then on the right side, instead of the huge billboard of patent numbers, we now just have Auto Ordnance Corporation, Bridgeport, Connecticut, USA. The guns were all marked Auto Ordnance because they were subcontracted from Auto Ordnance. Some were made by Auto Ord, some were made by Savage. This one was made by Savage, so you can tell from the little S underneath the barrel there. All right, now let's compare the M1 to the 28A1 And you'll be able to see that there are changes to virtually every element of the gun here. It's amazing how much they changed while keeping the gun fundamentally mechanically the same. So first off, Cutt's compensator is gone. You just didn't need it. It wasn't that relevant. The vertical front grip goes away. This was still something that they were doing periodically on the 28A1s, but the horizontal foregrip was something that Colt offered from the very beginning on the original Thompsons. By the time they get to the M1, this becomes the 100% standard. So we're not bothering with any of these anymore. The barrel fins, you can see there, those are gone. You really don't need to cool the barrel on a submachine gun. You can save a lot of machining time by just eliminating those. There are a couple of different things you can see on the top view here. First off, big change from top cocking to side cocking. This involves how the bolt is assembled. We'll get into the internals here in a moment, but for the time being, I mean, this is kind of obviously simpler. The rear sight is massively simplified. Instead of this adjustable flip up, there we go. Lyman sight, we go to just a fixed rear sight. Now, this is actually slightly more complex than the original M1 style. The original M1 just had this rear sight as a vertical tab welded onto the gun without these protective ears. And what they discovered was, through experience in the field, was that it was pretty easy to smash that rear sight on stuff, the ground, trees, rocks, etc., and bend it, and that was a problem. So they did go back and add, like, they made this stamped piece a little bit bigger. You can see it's still one component. They stamp it out flat, bend the wings up, bend the rear sight tab up, and then spot weld it, essentially, to the receiver. They made this rear sight a little more complicated just to make it, well, to protect the rear sight. So the very early M1s just have the rear sight. This is more common, and this, of course, carried over to the M1A1, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. A few other fancy options on the 1928s went away. We have a button here that allows us to just remove the stock on a 1928 Thompson. That is now gone. The stock is screwed into the pistol grip assembly, the lower assembly. It doesn't come off. There's no need to take the stock off of these. They add a reinforcing bolt to strengthen the stock, where it did have a tendency to crack or break on the early guns. The early Thompsons have like these really kind of fancy selector levers. Those go away. Now it's just a round stud with a pin coming out of it. There was some early production use of, leftover 1928 parts, but this was the standard essentially for the M1. There's very simple controls. Now here's a neat feature that has some synchronicity with the AR-15 of all things. On the 1928 A1s, the safety lever can only go into safe if the bolt's cocked. So here our bolt is forward, which means the gun can't fire anyway and the safety can't be put on. That, in theory, is a bit of a training issue. The AR-15 is the same way, and for example, one of the things HK did with the 416 was give them a safety that could be engaged whether the bolt was open, or, well, in the case of the AR, a safety that could be engaged whether the hammer was cocked or not. On the Thompson, the M1 got a safety that could be engaged whether the bolt was forward or back. They also narrowed the receivers. You can see the difference here compared to there. Now, in order to maintain compatibility with the original fire control elements, the lower receiver component, the bottom of the receiver here is wider, but the top is narrower. So they're reducing weight, they're reducing the material used a bit. And what they also do in the process is get rid of these grooves. This is a bunch of extra machining that is done specifically to allow the gun to use drum magazines, which actually slide in from the side. They don't come in from the bottom like you might expect. By the time we're at 1942, the military is not using those drums at all. In fact, what they do when they introduce the M1 is at about the same time they also introduce a 30-round stick mag for the gun. Colt originally manufactured 20-round sticks and then 50 and 100-round drums. I mean, it's pretty obvious. The sticks are so much easier to store, to carry, to use. But in order to make up for no longer having access to 50-round drums, they introduce a 30-round stick, and that runs on the M1, just like so. Disassembly remains basically the same here. What we're going to do is push this button in, and then we can slide the lower frame off. You do have to hold the trigger down when you do that to let the sear clear the bolt. So we can pull that off. The lower frame is basically unchanged with the exception of, I just told you, the controls. The stock's no longer easily removable or quick removable, but the mechanical system in here is basically the same. We do get a pretty significant change on the internals though. Now, these are both using small diameter recoil springs, but on the early guns, on the 1928s, you actually have to push this retainer forward, pull it all the way into the gun, and then lift it up and out. And that's a pain, especially for reassembly. What Savage's engineers came up with for the M1 was a much nicer system where we can actually push the recoil guide rod in from the back. I just have to push it in far enough that I can grab the buffer here, which is very oily in this one. There we go. I can lift this out, and that is the only thing that's locking the recoil spring in the gun, other than slightly kinking springs. So now I can pull the recoil spring out the back of the gun instead of having to push it all the way in and bend it up to bring it out. So this is also a revised version of the buffer. It's two metal plates with this fiber pad in the middle instead of this much more complex assembly there. You can even see on the 28A1s, we still have fiber pads inside for oiling. Yeah, that goes away on the M1. There's no need for that. Once the recoil spring is out, I can pull the bolt back, drop it down a little bit, pull the charging handle out, and I can lift the bolt out. Voila. Now here we have the M1 bolt and we have a 28A1 bolt. And the obvious, like the big thing, aside from the top charging handle, is this bit of brass, and that's the Blish lock. This was one of the core Thompson patents, and the concept was that the Blish lock would interact with the receiver, and because it was a dissimilar metal, it would have a different frictional coefficient depending on the amount of pressure applied to it. Now, yes, different metals do have different frictional interactions, but the concept of the Blish lock was that this would have a lot of friction at high pressure and not so much friction at low pressure, and that would delay opening of the gun as the Blish lock had to travel up like this. That turns out to be basically nonsense. And this is an open bolt 45 caliber submachine gun. The only thing it needs in order to run perfectly safely is to have enough mass just to hold in place like a simple blowback gun. So what we can do as Savage is, instead of making these three complicated parts, we can just make a big old block of a bolt, and it actually works just as well. This is one of those few instances where just as good is in fact just as good and a lot cheaper. So this is the main mechanical change between the original Thompsons and the M1. Now, what this leaves in place is the hammer. So even the M1 Thompson still had a hammer-fired system. We've got, you can see the pin there. This is the hammer and the firing pin, which is spring-loaded in there. And what happens is when the bolt hits the forward end of the receiver, when it's traveling like this, it's going to get to the end of travel. It's going to chamber a cartridge right there, and that last bit of travel pushes that hammer down, which causes the firing pin to protrude and fires the gun. This prevents things like out-of-battery discharges quite nicely because there's no firing pin extended until the actual moment of firing when the bolt's all the way forward. However, this is still not really strictly necessary. Most open bolt firing submachine guns don't have a system like this. They just weld the firing pin in place. It's fewer parts. There's basically nothing to break. And that would be the major change on the M1A1 pattern. So this is an M1A1 bolt. You can see they've taken the pin and the hammer here and just gotten rid of them. We'll talk about the M1A1 in a minute, but this is the final pattern of the Thompson that would follow. The M1 is kind of unique for having gone through all of the simplification it did, but still having this hammer-fired system. It is worth pointing out that an M1A1 bolt is perfectly interchangeable with an M1 Thompson. So the update process to go from M1 to M1A1 was very simple. Now, it does take some time to revamp the production tooling at Savage, and the first significant real delivery of M1 Thompsons takes place in July of 1942. Now, Savage was aiming for 85 to 125,000 guns a month. For context here, by the way, the height of production of the 1928 A1s was 40,000 a month, and the military wanted to bump that to 60 and then to 90,000. Well, Savage thought they could kind of blow that number away. They actually couldn't. It wasn't as easy for them to make as they thought it would be. In July of 42, they produced or delivered 48,000. Still pretty good, still more than the older guns, and they cost a lot less, which I'm sure the government appreciated. Auto Ordnance was supposed to be manufacturing these as well at the same time. Auto Ordnance ran into some QC problems actually getting the guns out of the factory. The biggest single issue seems to be that the rate of fire was higher than was technically allowed. They were supposed to stay the same rate of fire as the 28 A1s. Auto Ordnance's guns were faster. They were 700 or 800 rounds per minute. And for a couple months, there was Army pushback on accepting those guns. Eventually, they just got a waiver. They couldn't figure out an easy way to reduce the rate of fire without a bunch more engineering changes. And so they eventually just got a waiver. The Army's like, okay, fine, whatever, we'll just take them. So Auto Ordnance finally gets into the act, but they're a couple months behind Savage. Now, at the same time that this is happening, work continues on simplifying the gun even more, specifically that hammer system. So you already saw what the hammer system was. They would eventually get rid of that. That's the primary change to the M1A1 pattern. The M1A1 is recommended for adoption in September of 1942, and the first deliveries of M1A1s happened at the very end of October. So the M1 is really only in production for about 5 months. A total of 258,480 of these are manufactured. Most of them would go on to be updated to the new M1A1 configuration at some point during their service life, because basically all the internal parts are still compatible. It's largely just a matter of take out the M1 bolt, and put in an M1A1 bolt, and stamp a A1 on the gun, and presto, you've upgraded it. So that happened to a lot of them. And as a result, it's actually pretty rare to find an intact M1 Thompson. So very cool to get a chance to take a look at this one here at Morphy's. You may recall I did a series of videos a little while back on the different variations of the Thompson, and this is the one pattern that I didn't have at hand at that point. So I figured we'd cover it now. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.